This is one of the most tissue-specific PALS rails that we get into for the shoulder joint, and we're specifically targeting your subscapularis muscle. This is one of the 4 rotator cuff muscles, and it's essentially the muscle that is most responsible for pure internal rotation of your shoulder joint. Now, it's really important to have some sense of where that muscle is and what it's doing, how it's attached, because that's going to be how you're able to guide yourself into a proper stretch for that tissue. So this muscle, I think of it as the armpit muscle. It basically attaches on the very front of your shoulder blade, that is between your shoulder blade and your rib cage, right on the very front part, and then it wraps sort of around your rib cage onto the front of your humerus, your upper arm bone. So that way it's able to contract and shorten and rotate your humerus into internal rotation. Now, this muscle can get really tight, especially if you're often in this type of position or you're working hard in this type of position and you don't have a lot of time spent overhead, or for any number of reasons. But basically, we're going to use that rotational component as well as some flexion, some lifting of that humerus in order to actually get into that tissue. One more component is that we're going to do it with a bent arm, because once we go into a straight arm, other tissues go on stretch before the subscap goes on stretch. So if we want to get to the subscap, we have to actually bend the arm and put those other tissues into a little bit more relaxed position. So I'm going to be using a resistance band here hanging from a bar. This is a nice thick resistance band. It's really important to have something relatively stable and sturdy to work against. But you might just as well find a good setup on a shelf, a nice sturdy shelf, or even a countertop, okay? And I can kind of indicate how you would use that as we get into it. The last piece here is that you're gonna really have to go by feel, and probably the first round will be a little bit of a tester round. So go ahead, whenever you give it a shot, let me know questions that come up, and together we'll figure out your best position. But essentially, I'm going to put my hand into this strap, and then I'm going to make sure that my wrist is a little bit higher than my elbow. That is, my shoulder is in a little bit of external rotation, but we're not going to really prioritize external rotation, because we just want a little bit so that we're stretching that subscapularis in one kind of direction, but then the other direction is going to be into a little bit of flexion, like I was saying, kind of thinking of lifting that elbow straight out to the side of your body, up overhead. So once I have this set up with the wrist and the elbow, then I can sink my body or my armpit downward, and as I do, it will pull some armpit tissue into stretch. It will likely pull your armpit your shoulder blade out to the side as well, and that's fine. And then once we get there, then we can really highlight that stretch of the subscap that we're after. Now, once you think you've found it, you would hold it for the passive stretch duration that you're working with, either shorter if you're just trying to relax the tissue, or up to that 2 to 3 minute mark if we're actually trying to expand or lengthen that tissue. And then once you've passively stretched, your PALS contraction would be a combination of trying to bring your wrist downward as well as bringing your whole arm downward. So as I start to engage my PALS, I would engage that wrist down. Then I would think of closing my upper arm towards my body, but go slow with this so that we can really target the deepest tissues. Often if we go right up to the higher intensities without ramping slowly, the more superficial tissues will jump on, and then we won't be able to actually talk to and improve that deeper subscapularis tissue. Okay, so I'm PALS contracting. Now, a rails contraction would be exactly the opposite motion. I'm trying to lift my wrist above my elbow, as well as lifting my elbow for a contraction on the top of the joint. That might not be a possibility for you if you're getting any pain in the top of the joint, and that would just indicate we have more work to do in the bottom side, the subscap area of that shoulder joint, and generally the capsule in your armpit, okay? Now, if I was using a shelf or a countertop, it would be essentially the same position. I might need to set up a little bit lower, but the main thing to keep in mind is you do want your wrist higher than your elbow. So you might put a yoga block under your wrist, put your elbow on the surface, and then I can bias myself into that stretch, just dropping my body down that way. Instead, maybe a hand on a chair just to help me really feel secure in that setup. And then palesing one way, downward, and then rails would be to try to lift up that arm, but really just to try to contract the tissues on the top of the shoulder. All right, give that very specific setup a try. Let me know how it goes.